The sound of hooves pounding against hard-packed dirt echoed through the afternoon heat like thunder rolling across the New Mexico desert. And Sarah Vance knew in that moment she was about to die. The buggy lurched violently beneath her as the panicked horse tore down the main road of Stein's Pass, foam flying from its mouth, eyes wild with terror from the rattlesnake that had struck at its legs just minutes before. Sarah's hands bled as the leather reins burned through her palms, her arms screaming in agony as she fought uselessly against the animal's blind flight. The wooden wheels hit a rock, and the entire buggy lifted, tilting dangerously, and she heard herself scream as the vehicle threatened to flip and crush her beneath its weight. Through the dust and her own tears of panic, she saw a figure emerge from the side of the road. A man on horseback, moving with purpose and precision that spoke of years in the saddle. He urged his mount forward with a speed that seemed impossible, closing the distance between them in seconds that felt like hours. Sarah's world had narrowed to the sound of her own heartbeat, and the terrible certainty that these were her final moments on earth, that she would never see her father again, never fulfill the promise she had made to her mother on her deathbed to live fully and fearlessly. The cowboy pulled alongside the runaway horse, his body low against his own mount's neck. Sarah caught a glimpse of his face beneath the shadow of his hat, jaw set with determination, dark eyes focused entirely on the task before him. He reached out with one gloved hand, fingers stretching toward the bridle of her horse, missing once, then twice as both animals thundered forward at a breakneck pace. The edge of town was approaching fast, and beyond that, the rocky descent into the arroyo that would surely kill her if the buggy made it that far. Then his hand closed around the bridle. The cowboy's muscles strained as he pulled, his horse responding to his commands with trained precision. The runaway began to slow, fighting at first, but the steady pressure and the presence of the calm horse beside it seemed to break through the animal's panic. Gradually, terrifyingly slowly, the mad dash became a canter, then a trot, and finally, blessedly, both horses came to a complete stop just yards from where the road dropped away into nothing. Sarah sat frozen in the driver's seat, her entire body trembling so violently she thought she might shake apart. Her hands were still locked around the reins in a death grip, and she could not seem to make her fingers release them. The cowboy dismounted in one smooth motion and approached the buggy, his boots crunching in the dirt. When he looked up at her, she saw concern etched into features that were weathered by sun and wind but undeniably handsome. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own 21 years, with a strong jaw darkened by several days of stubble and those deep brown eyes that seemed to see right through her fear. "Miss, you are safe now," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that could calm spooked cattle or frightened women with equal ease. "Can you let go of those reins for me?" Sarah tried to speak but found her throat closed with emotion. She managed a small nod instead, willing her fingers to obey. They would not. The cowboy stepped up onto the buggy's running board, and the sudden closeness of him, the solid reality of another human being after those moments of certain death, broke something loose inside her. A sob tore from her chest, then another, and suddenly she was weeping without restraint. "Hey now," he said softly, gently prying her rigid fingers from the leather. "You are safe. I've got you." Once her hands were free, he helped her down from the buggy, and Sarah's legs immediately buckled. The cowboy caught her before she could fall, his arms strong and sure around her waist. He guided her to sit on a nearby boulder, keeping one hand on her shoulder as if afraid she might topple over. Given how the world was spinning around her, that was not an unreasonable concern. Just breathe, he instructed. Slow and steady. You had quite a scare there. Sarah focused on his voice, using it as an anchor while she fought to regain control of herself. Gradually, her breathing evened and the shaking subsided enough that she could think clearly again. She looked up at the man who had saved her life and found him watching her with an expression of gentle concern that made her chest tighten in an entirely different way. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough. "You saved my life. I do not even know your name." "Dalton Xavier, miss. I work on the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north of here." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar. "Are you hurt anywhere? You are bleeding." Sarah looked down at her hands in surprise. The palms were indeed torn and bleeding where the rains had ripped across them. Dalton pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and carefully wrapped one hand, then the other, his touch gentle despite the obvious calluses on his fingers. "I am Sarah Vance," she said, watching him work. "My father owns the general store here in Steins Pass. I was heading back from delivering supplies to the miners' camp when that snake spooked the horse." She paused, then added quietly, "I truly thought I was going to die. If you had not been there, I would have." Dalton finished tying off the makeshift bandages and met her eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went beyond gratitude and heroism. It was as if the universe had shifted slightly, rearranging itself around this chance meeting on a dusty New Mexico road in the summer of 1882. "I am glad I was," he said simply. "Let me look at your horse, make sure it was not bitten." While Dalton examined the animal, Sarah took the opportunity to really look at him. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of competence and confidence. His clothes were worn but clean, the typical garb of a working cowboy. Denim pants, a cotton shirt that had probably been blue once but had faded to almost gray, a leather vest, and well-maintained boots. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. But it was not the clothes or even the obvious physical strength that drew her attention. It was the care with which he handled her frightened horse, speaking to it in low, soothing tones while he checked its legs for injury. "You are lucky," Dalton announced, straightening up. "No bite that I can see. The snake must have just struck at the air near its legs. Scared it half to death, but no real harm done." He stroked the horse's neck one more time, then turned back to her. "Think you can make it back to town if I ride alongside you, or I can drive the buggy myself and pony my horse behind if you would rather." Sarah considered. Her hands throbbed, and she still felt shaky, but the idea of climbing back up into that driver's seat and taking the reins appealed to some stubborn part of her that refused to let fear win. Her mother had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. "I can do it," she said, standing up, "but I would appreciate the company." Dalton's face broke into a smile that transformed his serious features into something approaching beautiful. "That is good. I would hate to think today's events might keep you from doing what needs doing. Takes real courage to get back up there." As he helped her back onto the buggy seat, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. She settled herself and took up the reins, trying not to wince as the leather pressed against her injured palms even through the cloth bandages. The ride back into town was slow and careful, Dalton keeping his horse close to the buggy, ready to intervene again if needed. But the horse seemed to have spent its panic and walked docilely enough, apparently just as ready as Sarah to be done with excitement for the day. "How long have you been in Steins Pass?" Dalton asked as they rode. "I do not recall seeing you before, and I am in town fairly regularly for supplies." Just 3 months, Sarah replied. My father and I moved here from St. Louis after my mother passed. He wanted a fresh start, somewhere completely different. He bought the general store from Mr. Henderson, who was retiring. She glanced over at him. And before you ask, yes, St. Louis to Stein's Pass was quite a shock. I had never seen so much space in my life, or so much dust. Dalton chuckled. I imagine so. I have never been to a city that size. Born and raised in Texas, moved here 2 years ago when I got the job at the Double R. This land gets in your blood, though. All that space you mentioned, it starts to feel like freedom after a while. Is that what it is? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. I have not quite figured out what to make of it yet. Some days it feels like freedom. Other days it feels like emptiness. The difference is in what you fill it with, I think, Dalton said thoughtfully. And who you share it with. They fell into comfortable conversation as Stein's Pass came into view, its small collection of buildings looking remarkably substantial against the vastness of the desert landscape. Sarah found herself telling Dalton about her life in St. Louis, about her mother's long illness and her father's grief, about her own mixed feelings about this dramatic change in circumstances. In turn, he told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the older brother who had inherited the family place and the wanderlust that had driven Dalton to seek his own path. By the time they reached the general store, Sarah realized she had learned more about this stranger in 20 minutes than she knew about most of the townspeople she had met in 3 months. There was something about him that invited confidence, a steady presence that made her feel safe not just physically, but in ways she could not quite articulate. Her father emerged from the store as they pulled up, his face creased with worry that turned to confusion as he took in the scene. His daughter in a buggy with bandaged hands, accompanied by a cowboy he did not recognize. Sarah, what happened? Are you hurt? He hurried over, reaching up to help her down, but Dalton was faster, already there with his hands out to assist her. I am fine, Papa, Sarah assured him quickly. There was an incident with a rattlesnake and the horse, but Mr. Xavier here stopped the runaway before anything terrible could happen. He saved my life. Her father turned to Dalton with an expression of profound gratitude. Samuel Vance was a tall, thin man in his late 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow in recent years. He gripped Dalton's hand with both of his own. I do not know how to thank you properly, Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah is all I have left in this world if anything had happened to her. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. No thanks needed, sir, Dalton said, though he looked pleased by the gratitude. I am just glad I was there at the right time. Nonsense. You must let me repay you somehow. Supplies from the store, perhaps. Whatever you need, it is yours. Samuel was already ushering them both toward the store entrance, clearly not willing to take no for an answer. What followed was a rather amusing negotiation in which Dalton insisted he needed nothing. Samuel insisted he needed everything, and Sarah watched from a chair by the counter with barely concealed amusement as the two men went back and forth. Eventually, they compromised on a new shirt for Dalton, his current one having acquired a tear during the rescue that Sarah had not noticed before, and an open invitation to dinner at the Vance home whenever Dalton found himself in town. In fact, Samuel said, warming to his theme, why not tonight? It is nearly dinner time anyway, and I know Sarah would like to properly thank you as well. We have a decent roast, and it is the least we can do. Sarah felt her heart skip as Dalton's eyes found hers, a question in them. She realized she very much wanted him to say yes, wanted the chance to talk with him more without the necessity of watching the road or managing a horse. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. I would be honored, Dalton said. Thank you, sir. Just let me stable my horse at the livery, and I will be right back. After he left, Sarah became aware of her father watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face in a very long time, something that looked almost like hope. He seems like a good man, Samuel said carefully. Papa, you just met him, Sarah protested, but she could feel her cheeks warming again. Sometimes that is all it takes to see the quality of a person, the way he looked at you, the care he took with you, and the fact that he risked himself to save you in the first place. Samuel reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her daughter's ear, a gesture from her childhood that made her throat tighten. Your mother would have wanted you to be happy again, Sarah. To live, not just exist. Keep your heart open to possibilities. Sarah did not know what to say to that, so she simply hugged her father and went upstairs to their living quarters above the store to clean up before dinner. As she changed into a fresh dress and attempted to do something with her wind-blown hair, she caught herself humming, a habit she had not indulged in since before her mother's death. The face looking back at her from the mirror seemed brighter somehow, more alive than it had been just hours before. Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Dalton proved to be an easy conversationalist, drawing Samuel out on his experiences setting up the store and adjusting to life in the West, while also including Sarah in discussions about everything from the challenges of ranching in such an arid climate to their shared love of books. Sarah was delighted to discover that, despite his lack of formal education, Dalton was an avid reader who borrowed books whenever he could get his hands on them. My mother taught me to read, he explained. She was a school teacher before she married, and she made sure all her children valued learning. I have a trunk in the bunkhouse with more books in it than clothes, which my fellow ranch hands find endlessly amusing. What kind of books? Sarah asked, leaning forward with interest. Anything I can get. Right now I am working through some Shakespeare plays that the ranch foreman's wife loaned me. Cannot say I understand all of it, but there is something about the way the words fit together that I find compelling. He looked almost embarrassed to be admitting this. Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest. A cowboy who reads Shakespeare. A man who could gentle a panicked horse and speak thoughtfully about language in the same afternoon. She was rapidly discovering that Dalton Xavier was unlike anyone she had ever met. As the evening wore on, and the sky outside darkened to indigo, Samuel excused himself with a transparency that made Sarah want to both thank him and die of embarrassment. He claimed exhaustion from the day's work, and a need to review the store's account books, leaving Sarah and Dalton sitting across from each other at the table with the remains of their dinner, and several oil lamps casting warm pools of light. Your father is not particularly subtle, Dalton observed, but he was grinning. No, he is not, Sarah agreed. I apologize if that makes you uncomfortable. It does not. Dalton's expression grew more serious. Sarah, I know this might be too forward and you can absolutely tell me to mind my own business, but I would like to call on you. Properly, I mean. If that would be something you would want. Sarah's heart was suddenly beating far too fast. I would want that very much. Even though I am just a cowboy, no real prospects beyond my wages, living in a bunkhouse with a dozen other men. There was vulnerability in his voice now, a hint of the insecurity that lay beneath the capable exterior. You are not just anything, Sarah said firmly. You are thoughtful and brave and kind. You read Shakespeare and save people's lives and treat horses gently. Those things matter far more to me than money or prospects. Dalton reached across the table and took her bandaged hand in his, careful not to press on the injuries. I am glad to hear that. Because from the moment I saw you fighting to control that runaway, fierce and scared but not giving up, I have not been able to think about much else." They talked until late into the night, until the lamps burned low and Sarah could barely keep her eyes open. When Dalton finally took his leave, he bent and kissed her hand in a gesture that was old-fashioned and sweet, and Sarah floated upstairs feeling as if the entire world had transformed in the span of a single day. Over the following weeks, Dalton made the 10-mile ride into Steins Pass every chance he got. Sometimes it was for legitimate errands for the ranch, but increasingly it was simply to see Sarah. They took walks together in the evening when the heat had died down, exploring the edges of town and talking about everything and nothing. He taught her to really see the desert landscape, to appreciate the subtle variations in color and texture that she had initially dismissed as monotonous. She read to him from books her father stocked in the store, and they debated the merits of different authors with a passion that made them both laugh. The town took notice, of course. In a place as small as Steins Pass, nothing remained secret for long. Sarah became aware of the knowing looks and whispered conversations that followed them, but she found she did not care. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt genuinely happy, like she was building something new rather than just mourning what she had lost. Dalton was nothing like the young men she had known in St. Louis, the merchants' sons and aspiring lawyers who had paid court to her with varying degrees of sincerity. He was direct and honest in a way that was refreshing, and beneath his quiet exterior lay a fierce passion that showed itself in unexpected ways. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about the land, the intensity with which he listened when she spoke, the protective instinct that surfaced whenever anyone or anything threatened her well-being. One evening in September, about 2 months after their first meeting, they were walking back from the edge of town when Dalton suddenly stopped and turned to face her. The sun was setting behind him, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly vibrant against the darkening blue above. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, and there was a tension in his voice that made her nervous. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. The opposite, actually." He took both her hands in his. "I love you. I think I have loved you since I saw you refusing to give up on that buggy, fighting even when you were terrified. These past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life, and I cannot imagine going back to how things were before." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I love you too, Dalton, so much that it frightens me sometimes." He pulled her close, and she went willingly into his arms, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the steady thump of his heart. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other and the desert twilight, and Sarah thought she had never felt so perfectly at peace. "I want to marry you," Dalton said into her hair. "I know I should probably court you for longer, do this all properly and in the right order, but I have never been good at being patient about things that matter. Say yes, Sarah. Say you will be my wife." Sarah pulled back just enough to look up at him, seeing her own joy and nervousness reflected in his face. "Yes. Absolutely yes." The kiss that followed was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more. Dalton's lips were warm and gentle against hers, and she felt the care in how he held her, as if she were something precious and breakable. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he was grinning like a fool and she was certain she looked exactly the same. They married in October, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Steins Pass, with most of the town in attendance. Sarah wore a dress that had been her mother's, carefully altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Dalton had ridden out before dawn to gather. Samuel gave her away with tears streaming down his face, but they were happy tears, and when he placed her hand in Dalton's, he whispered, "Take care of each other." The foreman at the Double R Ranch, a gruff but kind man named Charlie Hobbs, had offered the newlyweds use of a small cabin on the ranch property that had been standing empty. It was just 2 rooms and needed work, but it was theirs, and Sarah had never been so excited about anything in her life. She split her time between fixing up their new home and helping her father at the store, while Dalton worked long days with the cattle and spent his evenings transforming the rundown cabin into something cozy and comfortable. Their first winter together was hard but happy. Money was tight and the work was endless, but they had each other, and that seemed to be enough. Dalton proved to be a devoted husband, attentive and affectionate in ways that made Sarah feel cherished. He brought her wildflowers for no reason, read to her in the evenings by lamplight, held her close during cold desert nights when the temperature dropped and the wind howled outside their walls. Sarah discovered that she loved being a ranch wife more than she had ever expected. She learned to cook for cowboys, to stretch limited supplies into hearty meals, to read weather patterns and animal behavior. The other ranch wives welcomed her warmly, teaching her the skills she needed and including her in their tight-knit community. She was particularly close to Martha Hobbs, Charlie's wife, who became the older sister Sarah had never had. In the spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The realization came one morning when she was overwhelmed by nausea while making breakfast, and the instant she understood what was happening, joy flooded through her so powerfully she had to sit down. When she told Dalton that evening, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then immediately set her down again and apologized profusely, worried he might have hurt the baby. "Dalton, I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said, but she was touched by his concern. I know. I am just so happy, Sarah, scared out of my mind, but happy." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with a look of wonder. "We made a life, a whole new person." Their son was born in December during a cold snap that had everyone huddled near their fires. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah was certain she could not do it, could not endure another second of the pain. But Martha was there, and Dalton held her hand even when she squeezed it hard enough to hurt, and eventually, finally, a baby's cry filled the cabin and Sarah was holding her son. They named him Dalton Xavier, for Dalton's father and Sarah's. He was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs and his father's dark eyes, and Dalton looked at him with such awe and tenderness that Sarah fell in love with her husband all over again. "Thank you," Dalton whispered that first night as they lay together, the baby asleep between them. "For him, for you, for this life we are building. I still cannot quite believe I am this fortunate." "We are fortunate," Sarah corrected gently. "Both of us. We found each other and now we have this beautiful boy and we have a future ahead of us. I would not trade this for anything." The years that followed were full of the ordinary struggles and joys that make up a life. There were hard times when drought threatened the cattle and money ran short, when illness swept through the ranch, and everyone held their breath hoping their loved ones would be spared. There were good times when rain came at the right moment, when Daniel took his first steps, when Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, and Dalton's joy was just as fierce as it had been the first time. Their daughter arrived in the autumn of 1885, a tiny thing with her mother's features and a surprisingly calm temperament. They named her Clara Rose, and Daniel, now nearly 3, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. By 1887, Dalton had been promoted to foreman after Charlie Hobbs decided to retire to a small farm closer to town where the work was easier. The position came with better pay and more responsibility, and it meant that Dalton and Sarah could start saving in earnest for their own place. They dreamed of having their own ranch one day. Nothing huge, just enough land to run a modest herd and build a real home for their growing family. Those dreams came closer to reality when Samuel Vance, whose health had been declining, decided to sell the general store and move in with his daughter and son-in-law. The sale provided a nest egg that, combined with their savings, was almost enough to make a down payment on a property that had recently come available. A small ranch about 5 miles from Stein's Pass with decent water and adequate grazing land. The negotiations took months, and there were times when Sarah thought the deal would fall through. But Dalton's determination and the good reputation he had built in the area worked in their favor. In the spring of 1888, they signed the papers that made them landowners, and Sarah stood on the porch of their new house, actually more of an enlarged cabin, but it was solidly built, and felt tears of happiness streaming down her face. "This is ours," she said wonderingly. "Really ours." Dalton wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Our land, our home, our life, built from nothing but hard work and love." He turned her to face him. "You know what the best part is? What? We are just getting started. Think about what we can build here, Sarah. Not just a ranch, but a legacy for Daniel and Clara and any other children we might have. A place that is truly home." They threw themselves into the work with energy born of ownership. Samuel, despite his age and declining health, insisted on helping where he could, mostly by watching the children and keeping Sarah company while she worked on transforming the house into a home. Dalton hired a couple of ranch hands, young men eager to learn the trade, and together they worked on improving the property, mending fences, building corrals, acquiring cattle. It was exhausting and sometimes frustrating work, but Sarah had never felt more purposeful. She created a garden that somehow thrived despite the challenging climate, learning which plants could tolerate the heat and limited water. She made friends with their neighbors, establishing the social connections that were vital to survival in such an isolated area. She bore 2 more children in quick succession, a boy they named James, who arrived in 1889, and another girl, Elizabeth, who made her appearance in 1891. The 1890s brought both challenges and growth. There was a terrible drought in 1893 that tested them to their limits, forcing them to make hard decisions about which cattle to sell and which to try to keep alive. There were years when the market for beef was strong and they could afford improvements to the property, and years when prices tanked and they scraped by on hope and determination. Through it all, Sarah and Dalton's love for each other remained constant. They had grown together, learned each other's rhythms and moods, developed the kind of partnership that made them stronger together than either could be alone. On their 10th wedding anniversary, celebrated quietly in their bedroom while the children slept and Samuel dozed by the fire downstairs, Dalton gave Sarah a necklace he had bought from a traveling jeweler. "It is not much," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "But I wanted you to have something pretty, something that was just yours." Sarah touched the delicate silver chain with its small pendant shaped like a wildflower. "It is perfect. But Dalton, you know I do not need gifts. I have everything I want right here." "I know. But you deserve pretty things anyway. You deserve everything, Sarah. Sometimes I still cannot believe that you chose this life, chose me. A St. Louis girl who could have had comfort and society, and instead you are out here in the middle of nowhere, working yourself to the bone." Sarah took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "I chose love, Dalton. I chose partnership and purpose and building something meaningful, and I have never, not for one single moment, regretted it. This life we have created together, it is exactly what I want." The kiss that followed was tender and familiar, the kiss of two people who knew each other deeply and loved what they knew. Later, lying in his arms in the darkness, Sarah reflected on the truth of what she had said. She thought about the frightened girl she had been that day in 1882, careening down the road in a runaway buggy, certain she was about to die. She thought about the cowboy who had saved her life, and in doing so had given her a completely different future than the one she had imagined. It had not always been easy. There had been moments of doubt and fear, times when the sheer difficulty of their chosen path had threatened to overwhelm them. But through it all, they had held onto each other, had remembered why they were fighting so hard to build this life. Love, Sarah had learned, was not just a feeling but a choice, a daily decision to put another person's well-being alongside your own, to build something larger than yourself. Samuel Vance passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1895. Surrounded by his family in the home his daughter and son-in-law had built. His death was a blow, but it was softened by the knowledge that he had lived to see Sarah happy and settled, had known his grandchildren and delighted in them, had been an integral part of the life they had created. They buried him in the small cemetery outside Stein's Pass, and Sarah planted wildflowers on his grave, the same kind that Dalton had picked for their wedding. As the century drew to a close, the Xavier Ranch was thriving. They had built a solid reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing, and their children were growing into capable young people who knew the value of hard work. Daniel, now nearly 17, was already as good a horseman as his father and had started talking about his own dreams for the future. Clara was 14, and showed a talent for managing the business side of the ranch that delighted Sarah, who had been teaching her bookkeeping and accounts. James and Elizabeth, still children at 10 and 8 respectively, ran wild on the ranch with the confidence of those who knew every inch of their land. On a warm evening in May of 1899, Sarah and Dalton sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over their land. The house had been expanded twice now and was actually quite comfortable, with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a parlor where they entertained neighbors and friends. The corrals were full of good horses, the range was dotted with their cattle, and the garden was already showing the green shoots of this year's vegetables. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked, leaning against Dalton's shoulder. "Every detail," he replied. "I was riding back from checking the fence line in the northern pasture, heard the hoofbeats and looked up to see you fighting that runaway. Thought my heart would stop when I realized you might not make it. I was so terrified. And then you were there, and even in the middle of all that panic, I remember thinking how calm you were, how confident, like you absolutely knew you would save me." She turned to look at him, this man who had been her husband for nearly 17 years, who had given her 4 children and a life beyond anything she could have imagined. His face was more weathered now, his hair showing threads of silver at the temples, but to her he was just as handsome as he had been that day on the road. "I could not have done anything else," Dalton said simply. "You needed help and I was there to give it. But Sarah, you saved me too that day, even if you did not know it." "How so?" "I was drifting before I met you, going through the motions of living but not really building toward anything, working for wages, sleeping in a bunkhouse, no real ties to anything or anyone. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to want more, to fight for something of my own. This life we have built, it only exists because you gave me something to build it for." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the happy kind that came from being overwhelmed by emotion. "We built it together. Everything we have, we made as a team. Best partnership I ever entered into," Dalton agreed. He stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that was as comfortable as it was passionate. Dance with me." "There is no music," Sarah protested, but she was already moving with him, swaying to a rhythm only they could hear. "We do not need music. We have the wind and the crickets and each other. That is more than enough." They danced on the porch as the stars came out one by one, as the desert cooled around them, and the sounds of evening rose from the land they loved. Inside the house, their children's voices drifted out through the open windows, arguing good-naturedly about something inconsequential. It was an ordinary moment, really, nothing special or dramatic, just two people who loved each other taking a few minutes to appreciate what they had built. But to Sarah, it felt like everything. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, back in those dark days after her mother's death when the future had seemed bleak and uncertain. Not just love, though that was certainly part of it, but belonging, purpose. A sense of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. As if reading her thoughts, Dalton pulled back slightly to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "I love you, Sarah Xavier, more today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "That is the sappiest thing you have ever said to me," Sarah said, but she was smiling. "I have been practicing. Thought it was pretty good myself." She laughed and kissed him, a kiss that held 17 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they finally broke apart, she said, "I love you too, Dalton. Thank you for stopping that runaway buggy. Thank you for saving my life and then making it worth living." "Thank you for being worth saving," he replied, "and for choosing to build this life with me." They stood together in the darkness, two people who had found each other by chance and held on by choice, surrounded by the land they had claimed and the family they had created. The years stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and joys, but they would face them the way they had faced everything else since that day in 1882. Together, with love and determination and the absolute certainty that whatever came, they had each other. Inside the house, Elizabeth called out that it was time for bed, and Clara was reminding James that he needed to finish his chores before breakfast tomorrow. The ordinary rhythm of family life continued, and Sarah and Dalton made their way inside to join it, to be part of the beautiful, chaotic, perfect life they had built. The Wild West was changing around them, becoming more settled and civilized with each passing year. The lawless frontier days were fading into memory, replaced by farms and ranches and small towns that were growing into real communities. But here on the Xavier Ranch, surrounded by family and land and love, Sarah knew they had captured something essential about what the West had always promised: freedom, opportunity, and the chance to build something meaningful with your own hands and heart. Years later, when her own grandchildren asked her to tell them the story of how she and their grandfather had met, Sarah would smile and begin the same way every time. "The buggy was tearing down the road behind a spooked horse, and I was certain I was about to die. And then a cowboy appeared, and he stopped it before it crashed. He saved my life that day, but more than that, he gave me a life worth living." And in the telling and retelling of that story, in the legacy they had built together and passed down to their children and grandchildren, the love between Sarah Vance and Dalton Xavier lived on, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most important moments of our lives arrive unexpected, in a cloud of dust on a hot New Mexico afternoon, and change everything that comes after. Their ranch continued to prosper into the new century. Daniel married in 1902, bringing home a sweet-natured girl named Rebecca who fit seamlessly into the Xavier family. They built a house on the eastern portion of the property and began raising their own family while working alongside Dalton to manage the ranch's growing herd. Clara, true to her early promise, took charge of the ranch's financial affairs and proved to have a shrewd business sense that increased their profits considerably. She married a banker from Silver City in 1905, and they lived in town but visited the ranch frequently. James and Elizabeth both chose different paths. James, showing wanderlust similar to what Dalton had experienced in his youth, headed to California to seek his fortune but returned regularly, always bringing stories of the rapidly changing world beyond New Mexico. Elizabeth became a teacher, fulfilling her grandmother's early vocation and establishing a small school in Steins Pass that served the children of the area. Through all of this, Sarah and Dalton remained at the heart of it, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing year rather than fading. Dalton's hair turned fully silver, and Sarah's face acquired lines that told the story of a life well lived, full of laughter and hard work and sunshine. On their 25th anniversary in 1907, their children threw them a party that brought together nearly everyone they had come to know in New Mexico. The ranch house overflowed with friends and family, with neighbors who had become like family over the years of shared struggle and celebration. Daniel had constructed a small platform in the yard, and there was music and dancing as the sun set over the land they loved. At one point in the evening, Dalton led Sarah out to dance, and the crowd made room for them, clapping in time to the music. As they moved together with the ease of long practice, Sarah caught sight of their children and grandchildren watching them with expressions of love and admiration, and her heart swelled with gratitude for the incredible gift she had been given. "What are you thinking?" Dalton asked, his voice close to her ear. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Sarah replied honestly. "That a chance meeting on a dusty road led to all of this, everything we have built and everyone we love. It seems impossible that so much joy could come from such a frightening moment." "Not impossible. Inevitable," Dalton corrected gently. "Because even if that snake had not spooked your horse that day, I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Sarah did not know if she believed in fate or destiny, but she did believe in love, in the power of two people choosing each other every single day. And she believed in the life they had built, brick by brick and day by day, through hard work and devotion, and an unwavering commitment to each other and the family they had created. As the party continued around them and the stars emerged overhead, Sarah and Dalton danced on, two hearts beating in time, two lives so thoroughly intertwined they had become one story, one legacy, one enduring testament to the transformative power of love in the Wild West and beyond.